Tea was developed and created in a time when there was a strong and rather derogatory attitude towards women. There was indeed imbalance in the way women and men were viewed in society, and you mentioned some of it in your writing. How do you think this influenced TA from its beginnings to its present day, to the present day?
Yeah, well, it's probably said better by people like Graham Barnes and Len Campos. Because I've just been looking back at all the things about diversity and culture in the early writing and in Burns' writing. So there's big problems there. It's like how Euhemerus has got huge feet of clay. Bearing in mind it was the 60s and lots of people had these views. It's still I find a bit disappointing because there was enough being written as well by other people to make the point that those views weren't right. So, if you go back and read Byrne, it's sexist, it's racist, it's homophobic. And it's a bit, I remember I must have read it all before lots of times, but when you actually read it with that focus, and you read Graham Barnes' article that he got the Memorial Award for, it's actually, I find it quite shocking how much of that was there. And even stupid little things, I think, about, Byrne calling the game Rapo. I don't call it that. When I teach it, I call it rebuff. And I take the sexual piece away from it. To me, it's like someone at work says, oh, you've paid for all that printing. We've got a great big photocopy you could have used. So you go next time to use it, and they say, well, I didn't mean you could just turn up and use it. It's busy. Because all his writing is all about, these women who keep tempting men into sex, and then it's a game. And it's not rape. And then when I see other writers who try to say that's what's happening like with refugees now, and I'm thinking, Aiken was the name, he wrote ages ago, he was writing about Burns, well, not about Byrne, but he was writing about homosexuality. And there was something about Byrne not taking into any account the real situation. Like Byrne's thinking, if you come out as a gay, you get beaten up, that's because you're playing a game. But actually, if you came out then, and in some countries now, you get beaten up or killed, that's not a game. You should be allowed to be who you are, and that's society doing something terrible. So to me, you're a real victim, and they are real persecutors without capital letters. So there's stuff like that back in Byrne's writing, which is really quite troubling.
Yeah, and do you think that this, definitely changed the community and the society? Do we still have some inheritance in our community on that, or?
I think we're much too quick to label things as a game. This is quite timely, although by the time you use this video it probably won't be quite so timely. But there's a manifesto out now which is implying that, if people just learnt some TA, we wouldn't have all these troubles with ISIS and refugees and so on. And it's a game. And it's like, it's not a game. If your house, if you got bombed and people were raping your children or turning them into child soldiers, you'd do everything you could to get out. What else could you do? So you'd become a refugee, you'd have no choice. Now the fact that you've got some money to do that is, well, yeah, I'd use all my money to get my kids out, or myself out, if that's what was happening. So I do think it's like Burns left this horrible legacy, really, about we're much too quick to look at what people do and think everything is script and it's a game, which is what he did about homosexuals. He insisted that heterosexuality was normal, anything else was a deviance, and basically he set up a you can't win, because he said if homosexuals don't come for therapy, that's because they're aggressive game players. Couldn't possibly be because they were okay with themselves. And if they do, then they're only coming because they want to stay as a homosexual, but they want to do something about the games. because he was so fixed on, no, they must want curing. So I think that legacy's in there and people don't think about it enough. So they get excited about, we can put the world to rights. And then you think, hang on, these kinds of conflicts, wars and religious conflicts have been going on for centuries. If they've been going on for centuries, we're not going to solve it by saying, oh look, we've got game theory. Just think, if everybody understood that, it wouldn't happen anymore. Yeah. It's a bit like the I'm okay, you're okay. I think that's a negative life position because it's Pollyanna. It's fine if we believe that we're all basically worth being here, but unless you can get everybody to believe it, it doesn't work, because then you get conned by the ones who don't believe it.
What do you think are the strengths of the training and certification process in TA, and what do you think can be improved? How does the TA certification process relate to your own understanding and development and growth? So it's like multiple questions in one.
It is, isn't it? The strengths are that it's a very okay way of doing something. It's also about the focus on, we want to know what you do know, not what you don't know, which is really different to most other certification processes. So I see those as the strengths. The drawbacks are things like it's not a good way of doing what we're doing, because we're just looking at one sort of snapshot of somebody. It's also a bit artificial, especially for TSTA, for the teach, for example. We wouldn't teach like that normally. We wouldn't do a half-hour or 20-minute didactic session. I know some time ago they talked about continuous assessment and it sort of died. But certainly I run an MSc now and I've based that on work-based continuous assessment. So you've got to keep on producing evidence, proper evidence of what you've done. So it builds up. It's not that you just come and do it once. I have a problem with the fields as well, because I think we've sort of made things difficult for ourselves by having separate fields. Seems to me there's a distinction between psychotherapy TA and developmental TA, and that one is about curing people, one is about helping people grow and change. Even then they overlap. But if you look at organisational, educational counselling, between them, they probably don't even cover as many different fields of application as psychotherapy does, and that's only one exam. So when I did my psychotherapy training, I worked with people in counselling centres and so on, private clients, and people in prison. But I never worked directly with drug addicts, I never worked with families, I never worked with children, because I would have needed more training in the UK anyway. There's whole areas that we don't work with them all as a psychotherapist, but there's one exam that says you're a TA psychotherapist. And that potentially covers a much broader span than the three other fields do, even between them. Plus it gets really complicated, because I did my organisational CTA before we had the fields. And when I look back, I did consulting in an organisation, I did team building, I did teaching, and I did coaching. So I have a real problem now, because I don't know what field to put it in. I also did a lot of work years ago, which did go to IATA but never went anywhere, of looking at all the competencies and showing how they're actually all the same for all the fields, because we're transactional analysts. It's only the context that means the evidence is a bit different.
So, for example, as a TSTA psychotherapist, would you see the actual certification being divided in sub specializations, for example, for children or for. I know this is not what you are saying.
No, not as TSTA. I think TSTA, there should be much more focus on you are now accredited to supervise and teach all fields. That's the role, PTSTA, TSTA, you can do everything. I think we should make sure that they do everything. They are familiar with it because they will have students, and often I'll meet students who've done quite a few years of clinical training only to then realise there's an organisational field or there's some other field that they should be in. And that to me is, well, that's lacking in how we look at PTSTAs and TSTAs. When it comes to CTA, I would have thought we ought to have one exam that's the same, that says, are you a transactional analyst? And that's the same for everyone, because we ought to know. When I did my training, we all did it together. So I knew what psychotherapists did, they knew what I did. And that got lost. I can see why it got lost because of professionalisation and so on, but we ought to be keeping it more similar. And then you could have one exam that says, are you a transactional analyst? And within that, you might cover one area where you work, but you could also cover 2 or 3 if you wanted to, and then maybe have something much simpler where you could add more things on. Because at the moment, let's say you've got a psychotherapist who has actually worked in an organisation. They haven't always, but obviously some have been employees or managers and now are a psychotherapist. Well, they know how to take a TA into an organisation. They don't make the mistakes that people make who've never been in an organisation. But it has to be that as if they're left that, well, you can't check your competence on that. We trust you. You have to know if you're competent or not. Why couldn't they just come back and do a little mini thing about this is how I use it in organisations, and then we can say, yeah, that sounds fine too. And then some organisational people or educators are doing psychotherapy as well. So why couldn't they come back? So you could have a basic, I'm a transactional analyst, and then you could add on as many different applications as you wanted. But it would need to be much simpler to do. You're not going to travel halfway around the world to take a 15-minute exam.
I wonder if perhaps these schools of TA that developed throughout the years came also from this type of need, because people were applying TA in different contexts.
No, I think most of the schools were all still in psychotherapy. If you look at
so it's
schools,
not the field, it's more about coming from the theory side and from.
I think the schools, no, it wasn't just the theory, it's the approach, but it's still largely psychotherapy. So if you look at the schools, classical cathexis redecision that Graham Barnes first wrote about, they were all psychotherapists. And then you look at psychodynamic and Richard Erskine's integrative, with the proper meaning of the word, as it were, not just putting in a bit of every approach you can think of, but integrating the human. And then constructivist, co-creative, relational, but they're all therapists doing it. When I write about developmental, then that's still about the approach, although I am thinking of non-psychotherapy. But it's almost like that draws across them all, so that shifts it into another context. But most of those were all written about doing psychotherapy. When I was working in prison, we often used to call what we did challenge psychotherapy. So we did a very much more confrontational style of psychotherapy to help people change enough so that they could be let out. And I would meet people, not that had TA therapy, but I'd meet people who've had they'd come and they'd say, well, I was in this other prison and I've done 2 years of therapy, but it would be either sort of person-centred or non-directive was what they called it. They just spent 2 years telling a therapist about themselves, but they hadn't got any awareness of why they did what they did, and therefore they didn't change. They just believed I'm like it.
You once wrote that you agreed with the statement that the distinction between different fields of application is damaging to TA, and I quote you. Although I recognize the need to be respectable and acceptable to other professionals, I have some regrets about the way in which TA has separated into such distinct fields. I agree with Claude Ramon, an article from '94, that the boundaries between fields are killing TA. At the same time, end quote, at the same time, you've pursued certification in several different fields of application.
Yeah.
How do you see the connection between these two?
Okay.
Or do you see any?
I see a big connection. There's my Machiavellian mode. If I've got all the qualifications, then people are going to have to listen a bit more when I say something. So, in the past, the answer would be, well, you don't really understand psychotherapy. You're not a psychotherapist. So, now I didn't do it for that reason. I did it as my anti-Alzheimer's technique. I just thought I need to be learning something more. What shall I do? I've done TA from an organisational point of view. I'd got educational through an expansion, so I obviously looked at that a lot. I then went off and did all the NLP training to become an international NLP trainer with Bandler. And then I thought, what shall I do next? And I actually went on trauma training because I thought that's what I would do. And I asked the person running that, did she have any recommendations? Because I could do TA or I could do NLP. Both I would have a really good start because I was already a trainer. And she said it doesn't matter because it'll all be irrelevant when you work with trauma victims. But obviously you have to have it as a qualification in this country. So she said pick the one you like the best. So I thought, fine, I'll do TA then rather than NLP. But what it also does mean is now I can say about the different fields and how similar they are and how different they are from a more sort of, I've got more status for saying it because I've done it. I've done through and passed the exams. And I just need to add in the counselling field now, which I am working on now. So then I'll have the full set. But that does mean, okay, fine, I've had to do all that work of understanding it and learning how to do it. And I can still say, are they really that different? I'm about to start a big research project anyway, not just in TA, because I'm in lots of different professional bodies. I'm going to look at, is coaching different to counselling, different to therapy, different to consulting, different to all those other names? And is the supervision of them any different? So I will be asking lots of people for that research. And I'll either show that they are different, or I'll show that no, it's common factors, the dodo bird stuff, you know, we all do the same thing actually, and it's the relationship and the person that matters. And I think back to when I did my TSTA organisational, it was hard in those days to get a lot of trainees doing organisational, certainly in the UK. So I went to Alice Stevenson's group. Alice was a TSTA psychotherapy in this country. And she let me come and supervise her clinical trainees. And that's how I passed my TSTA exam. Because I'd been working with her clinical trainees. And she's dead now, unfortunately, but she had a video that she used to keep and talk about of me doing that she used to say, I've got a video that shows you it's not different.
Wow.
It's supervision, it doesn't matter where they are. And what I would say to them is, I'll do TA supervision. I will not do DSM supervision, because in those days I wasn't using DSM, I wasn't familiar with it. So I would just say, if you talk to me in DSM language, I won't know what you're saying. We'll do it in TA language. And it's always struck me as odd. I know we have to do DSM or ICD-10 as psychotherapists because that's what the other professionals expect. But I'm thinking, what happened to Burns saying, don't categorise people, don't give them labels? So it's like, to please other professionals, we're doing that, but why don't we stay with the TA?
Coming back to the quote, you say these boundaries between fields are killing TA.
Yeah.
That's quite a strong word. And coming back to what you were just saying with pleasing others, pleasing other professions, perhaps that's what's happening. We're dividing into too many parts.
Yeah, I mean, I was quoting someone saying killing, and
Right.
that was whenever, 94.
Right.
And that was what it was a bit like. I mean, since then, psychotherapy has got recognised in various places. I've also managed to get developmental recognised. But it was like, and it's pulled us apart. And it's also like people didn't then know what the other TA people were doing. When we were all together, we knew, okay, we all work differently and so on, but we knew. So if I were a therapist, I would know that there were organisational people. So if my clients were in organisations, I would be aware of that. I would also know that there were referral options depending on what they wanted, for example, and vice versa though. If I was an organisational coach, for example, I would know that, well, where do I think that's outside my contract? I need to get them to go to see a therapist. And then what I'd realised by then was we're all running separate training programs. So people aren't getting that broad spread. And then you get into the groups, we're the in-group, they're not so good. So that's where you end up with our group's better than your group.
Yeah.
Across the different fields.